There is a very popular concept when looking back at colonial history, and it's something I often wondered about as a kid. Why didn't the colonizers just give full right to their colonies and became a bigger unified empire? The nation that may have come closest to this was France in real life, with the Frankification of many territories by promoting and, in a limited capacity, allowing the integration of colonized peoples into the French identity, and even governing Algeria as just a regular part of France instead of a colony. But in alternate history, the most interesting concept about this is the Imperial Federation. Britain had the largest empire in history, period. What if, by forming a federation of many territories, the British managed to unite with their former colonies into one big federation, where Britain would just be the main member, not the overlord of the others? So, what was the goal of the Imperial Federation? For the colonies, it was about increasing their influence, no longer being a subject to the British Crown and nation, but being autonomous parts of a larger imperial project. They would have large degrees of autonomy on many aspects, and they would have a direct say in the larger imperial laws instead of simply having autonomy and relying on British leadership for defense and foreign policy. For Britain, it was about maintaining unity and lessening the burden of having to maintain colonial rule. By the late 19th century, there were two prominent visions on an eventual future of the British Empire. The first option would be a gradual decline of the British Empire into an irrelevant second-rate backwater as it lost their colonies and other dependencies, being reduced to just their home islands or maybe even less, leaving Britain to stand on their own in the world. Well, will you look at that? While the second option would be federalization, giving more rights and influence to the British colonies to prevent them from declaring independence. By increasing the partnership and cooperation within the empire, giving autonomy on some aspects and referring direct British leadership to a larger imperial parliament, there would be little reason for many nations to declare full separation from Britain. So, when does this federation come to be? Towards the end of the 19th century. Much earlier would simply be unfeasible due to the massive amount of time it takes between London and the edges of Canada, India and Australia. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, technology is good enough that it would be possible, if slightly inefficient, to have a federal parliament that can directly govern and communicate with regions like Canada, Australia and India in an acceptable amount of time. In our own timeline, the first serious organization that really pushed for this federalization was founded in 1884. It's also extremely important that the process of federalization starts before the First World War, as the mistakes made by the British leadership combined with the horrors of the war reinforced the Dominion's separate national identity from Britain, further reinforcing their pre-existing desire to no longer be led by the British in many aspects, starting them down the road that would lead to complete and full independence. If we let Britain start a process of federalization after World War I, it would likely never work, since it would just be seen as a way for Britain to reconsolidate control over the dominions. So, how do we start this project? The British would regularly hold colonial conferences with the self-governing colonies within the empire. In our own timeline, the British delegates in the conference of 1897 and 1902 proposed the idea of a unified customs union within the empire and the establishment of a joint parliament that would have the power to bind the colonies on imperial matters. In response, Canada proposed preferential trade instead of a full customs union within the empire. None of these proposals went through in our own timeline. In this alternate scenario, however, we will propose that the organization known as the Imperial Federation League works tirelessly, especially among the leadership class of the British settler colonies, to boost enthusiasm for the concept. The 3 points they would use to boost this enthusiasm would be the shared British identity of the settler colonies, the reduced British leadership, and the increased influence that the colonies would receive from the Federation. Now realistically, this wouldn't work. The colonies weren't a big fan of the entire Federation concept, since getting more influence in foreign policy and defense also meant that the colonies had to pay for their own defense and maintenance of the larger British Empire. But for the sake of this scenario, the Imperial Federation League has mass success. So by 1897, the delegates to the Colonial Conference have a more favourable view of the proposals by the British and Canadian delegates. I don't see an instant adoption of a full customs union, but the Imperial Preferential Trade Zone would be established, encouraging intra-empire trade. They also accept the proposal of a permanent Imperial Council as an intra-empire governing body. This would be the first seed that would lead into further federalization within the empire. This new organization starts off being extra-parliamentary. This new institution has no direct authority over the self-governing colonies or Britain, but it would instead be a mostly advisory body, advising the British and the colonial governments on matters of defense and foreign policy. None of the decisions made by the body would be binding, they would just be an avenue for the Dominions to consistently voice their opinion on British and Empire policy. Which nations would make up this federation? No doubt, to start off with, it would just be the self-governing white settler colonies. Other colonies may join later, but there are two main problems which integrating the other colonies will have in the future. The first is plain racism. The British Empire was still a white-dominated empire on the road to exploit and or civilize their colonies, depending on your perspective. Even if the white settler dominions are now fully equal to Britain, this doesn't make everyone in the empire suddenly equal, so don't expect a radical expansion of the Federation in the short term. Then between the founding of the Imperial Council and the First World War, nothing massively changes in terms of world history. But internally, the unity of the empire is strengthened and keeps being mentioned in the colonies. The British Army, but more importantly its leadership, becomes, slowly but steadily, an empire-wide affair. The British settler colonies are extensions of the larger British nation, and we are all united. Then comes the First World War. In our own timeline, this was a massive break between the British and their dominions. In this scenario, we will change that slightly. There is now a rift within the colonies between the ones who want to steer towards further independence and the ones that saw the war as underlining the importance of British unity as the colonials and the British fought side by side as equals against the Central Powers. Because the officer corps is now a lot more imperial instead of just British, there is less direct blame to be placed on the Brits. With this growing rift in the dominions and the growing discontent due to the war and the example of the Imperial Council already in place, we will start to send the empire towards further federalization during, but especially after the war. With this push towards federalization, full Irish home rule would be established earlier, with Irish representation in the Imperial Federation as well. There would be many Irish unhappy about this new situation, and conflict would continue, but a unified Ireland would have their own autonomy and voice within the Federation. A supranational parliament would then be established, who the British and Dominion populations directly vote for. This parliament would be above the national governments, and they would mainly determine defense, foreign policy, trade, and maybe even colonial matters. But here we get another problem. Because how do we assign these seats? Does each member get a set number of seats? That sounds horribly unfair, as Britain has more population than all of the other dominions combined. We also have the factor of Britain giving up a lot of power in this deal, no longer being, by definition, the dominant power within the empire. Finally, we have the Dominion of South Africa. Let's assume that this proposal goes into effect around 1920. Almost 3/4 of the South African population is black. I doubt that these would receive full votes in this scenario, especially if it's up to the South African government. Removing these from the equation makes the difference between Britain and the other dominions even bigger. So we have about 40 million Brits, 8 million Canadians, 7 million Australians and New Zealanders, 4 million Irish, and finally about 2 million voting South Africans. This means that the British population by itself accounts for almost 2/3 of the population of the new parliament, resulting in the Brits probably gaining close to 70% of the seats in the new parliament as well, to account for their loss of power in the new arrangement. The colonies would then be compensated with a system where every couple of years the populations and the seats would be redistributed with the population in mind, meaning that when or if their population grows, they will become more competitive in this parliament. Meaning that British domination is not necessarily permanent, especially as dominions like Australia and Canada have massive potential for growth in the future. Is this a perfect solution? No. Would the dominions like this very much? No. But it's the only relatively feasible way this federation could be established. Britain was the dominant power. They would not give this power up easily. So, across the empire, local and empire-wide parties start being established and elected for this imperial parliament. Britain would have the highest turnout rate, as they are the only ones who fully support this proposal, with the lowest turnout rate in South Africa, as they only have about 3% of the seats, making it feel like their vote is inconsequential in the elections. Adding to this, the South Africans have the issue of their black population, making them one of the bigger dominions in terms of population, but having very little seats due to the black population not being included in the votes. It is very well possible that the elites of South Africa would be pushed to become less racist in this timeline. Over time, especially the parties that seek to have a larger stake in the Imperial Parliament, will attempt to push for the enfranchisement of the black populations in South Africa. If the black population can vote in the same manner as the whites in South Africa, then South Africa holds about 10% of the population of the Federation, over the about 3% when only counting the white population. As this is not a boost that would suddenly make South Africa incredibly dominant, it is very well possible that the other settler colonies and Britain start to push South Africa for black enfranchisement as well. If this doesn't happen, the imperial experiment may very well fail in South Africa, as the whites continue to directly oppress the black population, causing the black population to demand full independence, as they feel that the Federation brought them nothing but pain. But, assuming that South Africa, somewhere down the line, remains in the Federation and gives the black population the votes, this changes the parliament to something like this, with a significant increase in the South African seats. And this leads us to the rest of the empire. Let's begin with the elephant in the room, India. India can never be integrated into this Imperial Federation, in any scenario, in any reasonable way. Let's assume that India gets added to the parliament fully, in the same way as the Dominions. India now suddenly holds 80% of the seats in parliament, making the Imperial Federation into a Hindu-dominated Indian state on the federal level. This is obviously unfeasible. Now, let's assume that India does get added but has a massive reduction in seats to population ratio. Let's say a 10, 15 or even 30% of seats given to India. We will go with a nice little 15%. Congrats! Now we have more than 30 million Indians, which only barely have more votes than the 9 million people in the British Pacific territories. Obviously, this is unfeasible, as without full representation, India will seek separation down the line. India would potentially gain some recognition in the parliament in this scenario, but nothing would stop the desire for independence in the subcontinent, as it's fundamentally impossible to treat the Indians in the same way as the other dominions, just due to their sheer size. But for the rest of the empire, things are a little bit more nuanced. South Africa would become the gold standard. There was about a quarter of the population being white, and the rest of the population was small enough that integration into the imperial parliament can be achieved without upsetting the white-dominated balance of power. It's very well possible that some smaller colonies like Gambia, Sierra Leone and Somaliland would be contenders for eventual integration into the Federation. Although, we also need to consider if this actually brings any benefit to the already existing member states. What does Canada stand to gain from adding Sierra Leone to the Federation? Some medium-sized countries may also gain access, but it would be a lot more difficult and there would be limited appetite for many of them to actually join. Remember that this federation, slowly but steadily, becomes a nation in and of itself. This also means no borders and no immigration control. Bigger colonies like Egypt and Nigeria would have no chance of being added for the same reason as India. Adding them would upset the population balance within the parliament way too much, making the non-white colonials too powerful. And, as with India, they are represented in a limited capacity with reduced votes. They would not be happy with the arrangement and eventually seek secession. Territories in the British West Indies do have a population with a large enough white population and a small enough total population that they could very well be added to the Federation somewhere down the line. Smaller, strategically significant territories like Malta or Cyprus may also be allowed into full membership as well. Eventually, the Federation would look something like this, which leads us to the Second World War, which I doubt would be drastically different. I don't think much of global history and international balance of power is massively changed. The colonies would support appeasements to begin with, but eventually they would agree with the British Prime Minister and delegates that war is necessary. The Imperial Council would likely still put its foot down over Poland. The war itself is not drastically changed either. If Churchill still proposes the unification of France and Britain into the Franco-British Union, this proposal might be slightly more interesting for the French, as there is now a clear picture of how this new union might look. But, realistically, it still wouldn't happen. Although, that may be an interesting follow-up video. After the war, British decolonization is a slight bit faster than in our own timeline. There is now an easy demand for every colony to make. Either full integration into the Imperial Federation, including proportional votes based on population, or full independence. There is no middle ground. America and the Soviet Union would still push for full decolonization of territories not already in the Federation. The Federation would not be willing to fully accept most of these colonial states into the Federation for the reasons mentioned before. When going into the Cold War, the Imperial Federation would stand to be a strong ally of the Americans and would likely be the third most powerful nation in the world during the Cold War. The Federation would be the second largest nation on Earth. Their population would be around 10 million, most of which would be white Anglos, with black South Africans being the second biggest group. The Federation would be about the fourth or fifth nation in the world in terms of population. When we look at economy, assuming that the numbers aren't massively changed, which they would be, but I can't accurately predict, the Federation would stand as the undisputed third biggest economy at this point, behind only the Soviet Union and the United States. Eventually, they would be eclipsed by Japan and later China, but the Federation is still a massive economy, with influence and deals all over the world. The Federation would be immensely important in international geopolitics, as they are the easy anchor point for any Western-aligned nation across Africa and the Pacific. Would this Federation change the way the Cold War goes in a massive way? Probably not, but American power projection would be greater thanks to this ally. The Empire would try to remain tied to former colonies in many ways, just like with the Commonwealth of Nations in their own timeline. Some minor nations may even attempt to fully join the Federation at some point, but don't expect massive land grabs after the fact. The Empire would never be let into the European Union, which remains an entirely continental affair. Europe might be ever so slightly more unified in this scenario, as Britain, as a major European nation, dragging their feet on many integration proposals, did slow the continent down in our own timeline just a little bit. But obviously, the loss of Britain would also be a heavy hit for European economic growth, while the relative loss of European trade would hit Britain potentially even harder, while trade with the Federation can't make up for this as the distance is just too great. One of the main differences in this timeline would be the populations of Australia and Canada. I would assume that more people use the freedom of movement within the Federation to use the massive amounts of land and resources in Australia and Canada which go unused in their own timeline due to a lack of population in these regions. Over time, the dominance of Britain within the Federation would start to diminish. Britain will probably never stop being the single biggest contributing nation, but with the growth of the other members due to migration and faster growth would result in a less British-dominated parliament. Of course, getting to this point was already difficult in terms of realism, but I do see a bright future ahead for the Federation as the most vital US ally in international affairs. While regions like America, Japan and Europe would be richer than the Federation, those nations are, when compared to the Federation, self-contained and focused on local affairs. This Imperial Federation would be one of a kind, a global paragon of cooperation and democracy, furthering the Western cause and democracy across the world, especially among ex-colonies of the Federation. I foresee a stronger Western bloc in this scenario, with much of the Third World being closer tied to the Western ones. So, that's where I'll end the scenario. Not much may have changed on the map, but the geopolitics of having the first and only global nation, not based on domination, but based on actual nationhood, would be huge. This may even mean that colonialism doesn't fully die, as other colonial powers, mainly France and the Netherlands, hold on to a couple more minor colonies as they follow the Federation's example of actually giving full autonomy and influence on the national level to their colonies. But I thank you all for watching. To help the channel grow, please leave a like and a comment to fight against the algorithm. If you don't know what to comment, just commenting WOW helps out massively. As always, press subscribe to see more content like this, with an alternate history video every Sunday. And if you want to help me release more videos, then consider supporting me on Patreon. This helps me take more time for making more videos, while you would also gain access to every video immediately upon completion. As an added bonus, you get added to this awesome animation. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.